How did a 12-an-hour janitor steal $28 million from a cartel, turn their own security against them, and single-handedly destroy a money laundering empire that the FBI couldn't touch for 3 years? Stay until the end, because you'll discover how Luther used his invisibility to infiltrate their operation, how he turned a shipping container into the perfect trap, and how one night of revenge brought down the most powerful criminal network on the East Coast. Luther Braun pushed his mop bucket down the oil-stained concrete of Pier 47, the metal wheels squeaking against the perpetual dampness that clung to everything in this forgotten corner of the port. At 35, his shoulders already carried the permanent hunch of a man who had spent too many years bent over cleaning other people's messes. The morning fog rolled in thick from the harbor, carrying with it the stench of rotting fish, diesel fuel, and something else. Something that made decent people avoid this part of the waterfront after dark. The crew meeting had been scheduled for 7 a.m. sharp, and Luther knew better than to be late. Carlo DeSantis, the foreman, had made it clear that punctuality was the only thing separating the employed from the unemployed on these docks. Luther squeezed his mop dry and hurried toward the main warehouse, where 24 dock workers stood in a rough semicircle around DeSantis's imposing frame. Carlo DeSantis commanded respect through fear rather than admiration. His thick neck disappeared into shoulders that had once loaded cargo by hand, back when the port still pretended to be legitimate. Now, at 52, his role had evolved into something far more lucrative and infinitely more dangerous. He managed the flow of both legal and illegal cargo through Pier 47, and everyone knew which type paid better. The promotion list was short. 3 positions had opened up. Crane operators, the kind of jobs that paid enough for a man to support his family with dignity. Luther had applied for all 3, despite knowing his chances were slim. He had been mopping these floors for 8 years, arriving early, staying late, never missing a day. Surely that counted for something. DeSantis read the names with deliberate slowness, savoring the power he held over these men's lives. Tony Marcelli got the first position, Rick Santos got the second. For the third, Luther felt his heart pound as DeSantis paused, scanning the crowd with eyes that seemed to find amusement and desperation. The third position went to Jake Morrison, a 23-year-old who had been working the docks for exactly 6 months. Luther felt the familiar burn of rejection spread through his chest, but it was Raul Herrera's laughter that turned that burn into something darker. Raul Herrera represented the cartel's interests on the waterfront with the casual brutality of a man who had never been told no. His expensive leather jacket looked out of place among the work clothes and safety vests, but nobody questioned his presence at these meetings. When he laughed at Luther's visible disappointment, the sound carried across the warehouse like a crack of thunder. The rejection wasn't delivered with sympathy or even basic human decency. DeSantis made it clear that Luther's 8 years of loyalty meant nothing. He was trash cleaning up after real men, and trash didn't get promoted. The words hit Luther like physical blows, made worse by the snickering from workers who were grateful not to be the target of such public humiliation. Luther returned to his mop bucket in silence, his face burning with shame and rage. The other workers dispersed quickly, eager to distance themselves from his failure. Only the rhythmic slap of dirty water against concrete marked his presence as he worked through the rest of his shift, invisible once again. That evening, the docks took on their true character. The legitimate workers had gone home to their families, leaving the waterfront to those who preferred darkness for their business. Luther typically finished his cleaning duties by 6 p.m., but tonight he found himself moving slower, reluctant to return home to face his wife, Lily's disappointed questions about the promotion results. As he worked his way through the maze of shipping containers, Luther noticed something unusual about container 7734-B. The standard shipping label read industrial scrap metal, But the security ceiling was far more elaborate than any scrap shipment warranted. Multiple tamper-evident seals, electronic locks, and warning stickers suggested contents far more valuable than discarded machinery. His curiosity overrode his better judgment. Luther had keys to most areas of the dock. Janitors needed access to clean everywhere, after all. The container's lock yielded to his master key with surprising ease, as if someone had deliberately left it accessible to those who knew how to look. The door swung open with a metallic groan that seemed to echo across the entire waterfront. Inside, Luther's flashlight beam revealed stacks upon stacks of bundled cash, arranged with military precision. $20 bills, 50s, hundreds. More money than Luther had seen in his entire life, just sitting in neat rows like products in a store. His breath caught in his throat as the magnitude of what he was seeing sank in. This wasn't just a large amount of cash. This represented years of cartel profits, probably heading to some offshore account or money laundering operation. The container held enough money to buy houses, cars, entire neighborhoods in the right part of town. Before Luther could process what this discovery meant for his future, footsteps echoed from between the nearby containers. Multiple sets of boots moving with purpose, accompanied by the low murmur of Spanish conversation. Luther slammed the container door shut and fumbled with the locks, his hands shaking as he tried to reseal everything exactly as he had found it. He managed to lock the container and disappear into the shadows between two cargo units, just as Raul Herrera rounded the corner with two other men Luther didn't recognize. They wore the same expensive clothes and carried themselves with the same predatory confidence that marked them as cartel enforcers. One of them checked his watch and said something about a schedule that needed to be maintained. Luther pressed himself against the cold metal of a container wall, hardly daring to breathe as the three men conducted their business just yards away. Their conversation was conducted in rapid Spanish, punctuated by occasional English curse words, but Luther caught enough to understand that Container 734-B was leaving on tomorrow's midnight cargo ship bound for Mexico. $28 million. That was the figure one of the men mentioned, causing Luther's knees to nearly buckle. $28 million in untraceable cash, sitting in a container that nobody was supposed to know about except for the cartel's inner circle. It wasn't only his work they dismissed, it was his worth as a man, as a husband, as a human being. And from that rejection, something dangerous began to take shape. Luther barely slept that night, staring at the ceiling of his small bedroom while his wife Lily breathed quietly beside him. Their 7-year-old son Michael was having another nightmare, the kind that had become frequent since Luther lost his last shot at a decent-paying job. The boy's cries from the next room seemed to echo Luther's own feelings of helplessness and frustration. By morning, Luther had convinced himself that reporting the money was the right thing to do. He was a citizen, a taxpayer, a man who believed in law and order despite the corruption that had infected his workplace. Surely the police would want to know about $28 million in cartel money sitting on the waterfront. Detective Alan Reese looked like he had heard every sob story and wild accusation that desperate people could invent. His desk at the harbor precinct was covered with files, coffee-stained reports, and the general debris of a man overwhelmed by the futility of fighting organized crime with a limited budget and even more limited authority. When Luther walked into his office claiming to have discovered a container full of cash, Reese's expression didn't change from its default setting of weary skepticism. Luther tried to explain what he had seen, providing specific details about the container number, the type of locks, the amount of money. But with each detail, Detective Reese seemed to grow more dismissive rather than more interested. Here was a janitor, a man who cleaned floors for a living, claiming to have stumbled upon a major cartel operation. The detective had heard similar stories from drug addicts, conspiracy theorists, and attention seekers looking to waste police time. The rejection was swift and absolute. Detective Reese made it clear that the police had real crimes to investigate, committed by real criminals with actual evidence. They didn't have time to chase the fantasies of a disgruntled dock worker who was probably angry about not getting promoted. Luther was told to go home, keep his head down, and leave police work to the police. Luther returned to the docks that afternoon, carrying the double burden of being ignored by both his employers and law enforcement. His wife Lily had reacted to his story about the money with the kind of patient skepticism reserved for children telling tales about monsters under their beds. She thought he was creating elaborate fantasies to excuse his professional failures, transforming his workplace humiliation into delusions of discovering criminal conspiracies. The argument that evening revealed the depth of their marital strain. Lily worked 2 part-time jobs to supplement Luther's meager janitor salary, and she was exhausted by the constant financial pressure. She needed her husband to be realistic about their situation, not chasing imaginary opportunities that would only lead to more disappointment. Her plea for him to stay quiet and keep his job carried the desperation of a woman who couldn't afford to lose their only steady income, however small it might be. But Luther's position as the lowest man on the waterfront had given him access to places and information that others overlooked. 2 nights later, while cleaning the administrative offices, he overheard a phone conversation that confirmed his worst fears. Carlo DeSantis was coordinating with someone about increasing security around certain containers, and the timeline matched perfectly with Luther's discovery. The next week pushed Luther beyond simple shame. What he felt now edged closer to hatred. A rival crew had tried to stake their claim on Pier 47, and the docks answered in violence. 3 men carried out on stretchers, one never rising again. When Luther came in the next morning, the warehouse floor told the story before anyone spoke. Nearly 200 square feet soaked in red. Carlo DeSantis stood there with a mop bucket, making it clear exactly who would scrub the violence away. On his knees, he worked the bleach into wide, dark stains while cartel men watched with amusement. Raul Herrera joked that the janitor was finally earning his keep. The sharp bite of chemicals mixed with a metallic odor that clung to the air, a smell that would follow Luther into his dreams. That night, Luther made a decision that would change everything. If the police wouldn't take his word seriously, he would gather evidence they couldn't ignore. He began carrying a small digital camera during his cleaning rounds, documenting suspicious activities, unusual shipping patterns, and the faces of men who conducted business in shadows. The photography required careful timing and considerable risk. Luther had to capture clear images without being noticed, often working in near darkness while maintaining the appearance of performing his normal duties. Over the course of 2 weeks, he documented shipping schedules that didn't match official manifests, meetings between known cartel figures and port officials, and most importantly, the specific containers that received special handling, despite being labeled as ordinary cargo. His investigation revealed that container 7734-B was part of a larger pattern. Multiple containers were being processed outside normal channels, all labeled as low-value cargo while receiving high-security treatment. Luther began mapping the entire operation, creating a detailed picture of how the cartel was using Pier 47 to move money and contraband through what appeared to be legitimate shipping operations. The breakthrough came when Luther discovered that he wasn't the only one who had noticed the irregularities. Teresa Mendoza worked in the dock cafeteria, serving coffee and sandwiches to workers during shift changes. Her position made her nearly as invisible as Luther, but it also gave her opportunities to overhear conversations that cartel members assumed were private. Teresa had been documenting suspicious activities in her own way, keeping a notebook of unusual shipping patterns and strange visitors. When she accidentally learned about Luther's investigation, they realized that their combined observations painted a comprehensive picture of the cartel's operations. Together, they had evidence of systematic money laundering, document fraud, and corruption that reached into the highest levels of port management. But their investigation had not gone completely unnoticed. One evening, while Luther was photographing a late-night meeting between Carlo DeSantis and a man in an expensive suit, he found himself locked inside the main warehouse. The electronic locks that normally opened with his keycard had been programmed to deny him access, trapping him in the building with Container 7, 1734B, and whatever other illegal cargo surrounded him in the darkness. Every rejection sharpened his rage, but rage without a plan was suicide. He was about to turn it into a weapon. The warehouse lockdown lasted 4 hours, during which Luther used his forced confinement to conduct the most thorough investigation of his career as an accidental detective. With access to containers, shipping documents, and areas normally off-limits even to janitors, he documented evidence that revealed the full scope of the cartel's operations at Pier 47. Container 7734-B was scheduled to leave on the midnight cargo ship Estrella del Mar, bound for Veracruz, Mexico. The shipping manifest listed its contents as industrial scrap metal with a declared value of $12,000. Luther's photographs revealed that the container actually held $28 million in cash, representing months of cartel profits from drug sales, extortion, and human trafficking operations along the eastern seaboard. When security finally released the electronic locks at midnight, Luther emerged from the warehouse with a memory card full of evidence and a plan that terrified him with its audacity. He wasn't just going to expose the cartel's money laundering operation. He was going to steal their money and use it to destroy their entire network. The plan required precise timing and considerable courage, two qualities that Luther had never been forced to develop during his years of invisible servitude. But humiliation had been an excellent teacher, and rejection had provided the motivation necessary to attempt something that rational men would consider suicidal. Raul Herrera's suspicions about Luther had been growing since the container incident. The janitor's behavior had changed in subtle but noticeable ways. He moved through the warehouse with more purpose, paid attention to conversations that shouldn't interest someone whose job involved mopping floors, and asked questions about shipping schedules that had nothing to do with his cleaning responsibilities. The confrontation came during Luther's lunch break, when Raul cornered him between two shipping containers and made his concerns explicit through violence rather than conversation. The beating was methodical rather than passionate, designed to extract information rather than simply inflict pain. Raul wanted to know what Luther had seen, what he had told anyone, and whether his unusual interest in cartel business represented a threat that needed to be eliminated permanently. Luther's response surprised both of them. Instead of the expected pleading and promises to stay quiet, he absorbed the punishment in silence and met Raul's threats with steady eye contact that suggested he was no longer the same man who had been humiliated at the crew meeting weeks earlier. The beating only strengthened Luther's resolve to proceed with his impossible plan. During his recovery, Luther finalized the details of an operation that would require him to intercept container 7734-B during the narrow window between its loading and the ship's departure. The cargo area of Pier 47 was a maze of containers, cranes, and vehicles that provided numerous hiding places for someone who knew the layout intimately. Luther's 8 years of cleaning every square foot of the facility had given him knowledge that even the security staff lacked. The timing had to be perfect. Container 7734-B would be loaded onto the Estrella del Mar between 11:30 p.m. and midnight, a process that typically took 20 minutes with the port's automated loading equipment. During those 20 minutes, the container would be positioned on the loading dock, but not yet secured to the ship, creating a brief opportunity for someone with the right access codes to redirect it to a different location. Luther had spent weeks observing the loading process, memorizing the routes that different types of cargo followed from the storage areas to the ships. He knew which crane operators could be bribed, which security guards were sleeping on duty, and, most importantly, which shipping manifests could be altered without triggering immediate investigation. His plan involved substituting Container 734-B with an identical container filled with actual scrap metal, a deception that wouldn't be discovered until the Estrella del Mar reached Mexican waters and cartel representatives attempted to retrieve their money. By then, Luther would have had 12 hours to execute the second phase of his plan, using the cartel's own money to finance their destruction. Emily Navarro represented exactly the kind of ambitious journalism that could transform Luther's evidence into a national scandal. At 29, she had built a reputation for investigative reporting that had already cost several politicians their careers and landed multiple business executives in federal prison. Her blog focused on corruption in port cities, making her the perfect ally for someone with evidence of cartel money laundering operations. Luther's initial contact with Emily was conducted through encrypted email and anonymous phone calls, a level of operational security that surprised both of them. His evidence was meticulously organized, professionally photographed, and supported by documentation that demonstrated months of careful investigation. Emily quickly realized that Luther's information represented the kind of story that could launch careers and topple criminal organizations. Their first face-to-face meeting took place in a coffee shop 20 miles from the waterfront, where Luther provided Emily with copies of his evidence while explaining his plan to intercept the cartel's money shipment. Emily's journalistic instincts were immediately engaged by the scope of the story, but her survival instincts warned her that investigating cartel operations was inherently dangerous for everyone involved. Luther's transformation from invisible janitor to criminal mastermind was nearly complete, but his plan required one final element that would test his nerve and his luck in equal measure. Container 7734-B was scheduled to leave Pier 47 in 72 hours, and Luther needed to position himself to intercept it without arousing suspicion from the cartel's security network. The janitor no one ever noticed was about to make a choice: disappear quietly, or take something so valuable it could cost him his life. Luther's hands trembled as he checked his watch for the 12th time that evening. 11:47 p.m., Container 7734-B would begin its journey to the loading dock in exactly 13 minutes, following the same route it had taken every month for the past 3 years. But tonight, that route would lead somewhere entirely different. The automated crane system that moved containers from storage to ship loading operated on computerized schedules that could be modified by anyone with administrative access. Luther had spent weeks memorizing Carlo DeSantis's logging credentials, watching the foreman enter his password during routine operations while pretending to mop nearby floors. The irony wasn't lost on him that his invisibility as a janitor had made him the perfect industrial spy. At 11:52 p.m., Luther accessed the port's shipping management system from a terminal in the administrative building. His janitor's key card provided access to areas that most employees never saw, including the control room where all cargo movements were coordinated. The night shift supervisor was making his rounds on the opposite side of the facility, giving Luther exactly the window he needed to implement his plan. Container 7734-B appeared on the system as scheduled for immediate loading onto the Estrella del Mar. With 3 keystrokes, Luther changed its destination from Shiploading Bay 3 to Temporary Storage Area 7, a section of the port that was currently empty due to maintenance work on the overhead cranes. The system accepted the change without question, treating it as a routine scheduling adjustment rather than the theft of $28 million. The substitution required split-second timing and nerves that Luther wasn't sure he possessed. Container 734X contained actual industrial scrap metal and was scheduled for loading onto a different ship the following week. Luther's modifications to the shipping manifest redirected Container 7734X to take the place of the money shipment, ensuring that the Estrella del Mar would depart on schedule with cargo that appeared identical to what the cartel was expecting. Luther watched from the shadows as the massive crane lifted Container 7734-B and began moving it toward what the operators believed was the shiploading area. Instead, the automated system guided the container to the deserted storage area where Luther had positioned a stolen forklift and a refrigerated truck that he had borrowed from the port's vehicle pool. The container touched down with a metallic thud that seemed to echo across the entire waterfront. Luther emerged from his hiding place and approached the 20-foot steel box that contained more money than he had ever imagined touching. His bolt cutters made quick work of the security seals, and the container door swung open to reveal the same neat stacks of bundled cash that had haunted his dreams for weeks. $28 million in various denominations, organized with the methodical precision of a legitimate banking operation. Luther had brought duffel bags and plastic storage containers, but he quickly realized that $28 million in cash occupied far more space than he had anticipated. Each bundle of hundreds contained $10,000, and there were hundreds of bundles arranged in precise rows. His plan called for taking only enough money to finance his war against the cartel, while leaving the majority as evidence for federal investigators. But standing in front of such wealth, Luther felt the temptation that had corrupted countless honest men throughout history. This money represented freedom from financial stress, college tuition for his son, a house in a neighborhood where children could play safely outside. Instead, Luther forced himself to follow his original plan. He photographed every stack, every bundle, every serial number that he could see clearly. Then, he loaded exactly $2 million into his bags, enough to fund Emily Navarro's investigation, bribe port security guards for additional information, and ensure his family's safety during the dangerous months ahead. The remaining $26 million stayed in the container, but Luther added something that hadn't been there before: a GPS tracking device that would allow federal investigators to monitor the container's location in real time. He also planted copies of his photographic evidence throughout the money stacks, ensuring that anyone who opened the container would find comprehensive documentation of the cartel's entire operation. Resealing the container required different locks that would appear identical to the originals, while providing Luther with continued access if necessary. He had practiced this process dozens of times using similar containers filled with legitimate cargo, timing himself until he could complete the entire operation in under 15 minutes. At 12:23 a.m., Container 7734-B sat in temporary storage area. 7 with $2 million missing, and a federal investigation's worth of evidence planted among the remaining cash. The automated system showed that the container had been successfully loaded onto the Estrella del Mar, and the ship's manifest confirmed that all cargo was secure and accounted for. Luther drove the refrigerated truck to a storage facility 30 miles from the port, where he transferred his stolen fortune to a climate-controlled unit that he had rented under a false identity. $2 million in cash filled 12 large duffel bags that would remain hidden until he was ready to use them against the men who had stolen his dignity for 8 years. The genius of Luther's plan lay not just in the theft itself, but in the time it would take for anyone to discover that the money was missing. Container 7734-B would remain in storage for at least 24 hours before anyone checked its contents, And even then, the thieves would assume that dock workers or ship's crew had discovered and stolen the money during routine loading operations. By the time Raul Herrera and his associates realized that their money shipment had been intercepted, Luther would have had enough time to begin the second phase of his plan. Using the cartel's own money to finance their destruction through Emily Navarro's investigation and strategic bribes that would turn their allies against them. Luther returned to his apartment at 3:17 a.m., exhausted but exhilarated by what he had accomplished. For the first time in 8 years, he felt like a man who controlled his own destiny rather than a victim of other people's decisions. The $2 million hidden in the storage facility represented more than money. It was proof that invisible people could become powerful when they refused to accept invisibility as permanent. His wife Lily slept peacefully beside him, unaware that her husband had just committed one of the largest thefts in the port's history. Luther stared at the ceiling and wondered if she would be proud of what he had done or horrified by the risks he had taken. Either way, their lives were about to change in ways that neither of them could imagine. The stolen money would fund Emily's investigation, bribe security guards for additional evidence, and provide Luther's family with protection during the dangerous period when the cartel discovered their loss. But, more importantly, it would serve as the foundation for a campaign of revenge that would transform Luther from victim to victor in a war he had never chosen to fight. $26 million remained in container 7734-B, along with evidence that would eventually bring down the entire money laundering operation. But Luther's $2 million would ensure that he controlled the timing and methods of that downfall, rather than leaving justice to federal agencies that had ignored his initial attempts to report criminal activity. The heist was complete, but Luther's transformation from humiliated janitor to criminal mastermind was just beginning. He had stolen the cartel's money, but more importantly, he had stolen their sense of security and invincibility. They would soon learn that invisible people could be the most dangerous enemies of all. Luther's preparation for intercepting the money shipment required him to think like a criminal while maintaining the appearance of performing his normal duties. He spent his shifts mapping security camera blind spots, identifying the precise timing of guard rotations, and memorizing the electronic access codes that controlled container movement throughout the facility. The key to his plan lay in exploiting the automated systems that managed cargo flow at Pier 47. Container movements were controlled by computerized manifests that could be altered by anyone with administrative access to the port's shipping database. Luther had observed Carlo DeSantis entering his access codes hundreds of times during routine operations, and his janitor's invisibility had made such observations appear innocent rather than threatening. Emily Navarro's investigation had progressed rapidly once she began verifying Luther's evidence through her network of sources in law enforcement and federal agencies. Her preliminary research confirmed that Pier 47 had been flagged by multiple agencies as a suspected money laundering operation. But previous investigations had been hampered by lack of inside information, and the port's legitimate business activities serving as effective cover for illegal operations. The scope of the cartel's operations exceeded even Luther's comprehensive documentation. Emily's sources revealed that Container 773-4-B was part of a monthly money transfer system that had been operating for over 3 years, moving an estimated $300 million annually through what appeared to be routine shipping manifests. The $28 million that Luther had discovered represented just 1 month's profits from the cartel's eastern seaboard operations. Emily's investigation attracted attention from federal agencies that had been monitoring cartel activities along the eastern coastline. Agent Collins from the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network had been tracking suspicious money movements through several East Coast ports, and Luther's evidence provided the missing pieces of a puzzle that investigators had been working on for 2 years. However, Luther's amateur investigation had not escaped notice from the cartel security network. Carlo DeSantis had begun receiving reports about the janitor's unusual behavior, his questions about shipping schedules, and his presence in areas that had nothing to do with his cleaning responsibilities. The reports painted a picture of someone conducting surveillance rather than performing maintenance duties. Carlo's response was swift and predictable. Rather than confronting Luther directly, he chose to frame him for theft of port property, a charge that would discredit any allegations Luther might make about discovering illegal cargo. The frame-up involved planting stolen tools and equipment in Luther's locker, then arranging for a surprise inspection that would reveal the planted evidence. The theft charges were designed to accomplish multiple objectives. They would provide justification for firing Luther and banning him from port property, eliminating his access to the containers and shipping areas where he had been conducting his investigation. More importantly, they would destroy his credibility as a potential witness, transforming him from a concerned citizen reporting criminal activity into a disgruntled employee, making false accusations against his former employer. Detective Reese found himself forced to reconsider his earlier dismissal of Luther's claims when the theft charges revealed inconsistencies that suggested deliberate fabrication. The planted evidence was too convenient, the timing too coincidental, and Luther's reaction too calm for someone genuinely guilty of theft. More importantly, federal investigators had begun asking questions about activities at Pier 47. Questions that aligned perfectly with Luther's previous allegations about cartel money laundering. The detectives' renewed investigation revealed that Luther's claims about container 7734-B could be verified through shipping records, security camera footage, and testimony from other dock workers who had noticed unusual activities but had been afraid to report them. The pattern of evidence suggested that Luther's allegations were not only credible, but represented just the visible surface of a much larger criminal operation. Emily's preparation of her exposé had reached the final stages when she disappeared following a meeting with a source who claimed to have additional information about cartel operations at the port. Her last communication was a text message to Luther indicating that she had received an offer of information that would complete their story. But she failed to return home that evening or respond to subsequent communications. The disappearance of a journalist investigating cartel activities sent immediate alarm signals through law enforcement agencies that had been monitoring the situation. Emily's disappearance transformed Luther's evidence from an interesting case into an urgent federal investigation, bringing resources and attention that neither Luther nor the cartel had anticipated. Federal investigators moved quickly to secure Luther's safety while preparing warrants for a comprehensive investigation of Pier 47's operations. Agent Collins recognized that Luther represented the key witness in a case that could dismantle one of the East Coast's largest money laundering operations, making his protection a high priority for multiple federal agencies. Luther found himself in the surreal position of being protected by the same federal government that had ignored his initial attempts to report criminal activity. The transformation from dismissed janitor to key federal witness occurred so rapidly that he barely had time to process the magnitude of what his investigation had unleashed. Container 7734-B remained on schedule for its midnight departure, but federal agencies were now tracking its movement while preparing coordinated raids that would strike multiple cartel operations simultaneously. Luther's evidence had provided the foundation for a federal operation that would extend far beyond Pier 47 to include cartel activities in 6 states and 3 countries. The man everyone laughed at had become the only credible witness, and that credibility was a death sentence. The cartel's response to federal attention was swift and violent, beginning with Luther's kidnapping from the safe house where federal agents had been protecting him. The abduction was conducted with military precision, suggesting that cartel operatives had been monitoring federal activities and had identified Luther's location despite extensive security measures. Luther awakened in the basement of a warehouse several miles from Pier 47, secured to a chair with industrial restraints and facing Raul Herrera's cold smile. The cartel enforcer had taken personal responsibility for extracting information about Luther's investigation, his federal contacts, and the location of any evidence that might still threaten cartel operations. The interrogation revealed that the cartel had been aware of Luther's activities far longer than he had realized. They had allowed his investigation to continue in order to identify all potential threats to their operations, including Emily Navarro's journalistic investigation and the federal agencies that had begun monitoring Pier 47. Luther's evidence had served as bait that drew their enemies into the open where they could be eliminated systematically. However, Luther's 8 years of invisible servitude at Pier 47 had given him knowledge of the facility that even Raul Herrera lacked. The basement where they were holding him was part of the port's original infrastructure, built decades earlier when the facility had been designed for different types of cargo operations. Luther knew about maintenance tunnels, utility access points, and emergency exits that had been forgotten by everyone except the janitor, who had cleaned them regularly. His escape was facilitated by the same invisibility that had made him an effective investigator. Luther had spent years moving through the port's infrastructure without being noticed, and that experience served him well when he needed to disappear from cartel custody. The maintenance tunnels that connected the various warehouse buildings allowed him to reach the main port facility without being detected by the cartel operatives who were searching for him. Emily Navarro's rescue occurred simultaneously with Luther's escape, as federal agents raided the location where she had been held captive. Her abduction had been intended to prevent publication of her exposé, but federal investigators had been tracking cartel communications and had identified her location through electronic surveillance. Emily emerged from her ordeal, shaken but determined to complete the story that had nearly cost her life. Luther's final delivery of evidence to federal investigators included not only his original documentation of cartel activities, but also intelligence he had gathered during his captivity. His conversations with Raul Herrera had revealed details about cartel operations beyond Pier 47, including money laundering activities at ports in Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. The federal raids that followed were coordinated across multiple states and represented the largest crackdown on cartel money laundering operations in the agency's history. Container 7734-B was seized just minutes before the Estrella del Mar was scheduled to depart, along with 23 other containers that contained drugs, weapons, and cash destined for various criminal organizations. The $28 million that Luther had discovered proved to be just one component of a cartel financial network that had moved over $800 million through East Coast ports during the previous 3 years. Federal seizures ultimately recovered nearly $200 million in cash and assets, delivering a devastating blow to the cartel's financial operations. Carlo DeSantis was arrested at his home and charged with money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to distribute controlled substances. His cooperation with federal investigators revealed the full scope of corruption that had enabled cartel operations at Pier 47, leading to additional arrests of port officials, security personnel, and local politicians who had been receiving cartel payments. Raul Herrera's story ended in the same warehouse where Luther had once been chained. When federal agents stormed the building, he chose confrontation over surrender, and the echoes of gunfire sealed his fate. With him gone, the cartel's grip on the waterfront finally began to loosen, opening the door to a sweeping investigation that would reach across the eastern seaboard. Emily Navarro's exposé, published 3 weeks after the federal raids, revealed the full story of how a humiliated dock janitor had infiltrated and ultimately destroyed one of the country's largest money laundering operations. Her article, titled The Janitor Who Brought Down the Docks became one of the most widely read investigative pieces of the year and earned her a Pulitzer Prize nomination. Luther's transformation from invisible janitor to federal witness was complete. But his victory came with costs that extended beyond the obvious dangers he had faced. His marriage to Lily had not survived the stress of his investigation, and his relationship with his 7-year-old son, Michael, had been complicated by the trauma of witnessing his father's abduction and the subsequent media attention. The federal government's witness protection program offered Luther a new identity and relocation to a different part of the country, but he chose instead to remain in the port city where his investigation had begun. The Pier 47 facility had been transformed by federal oversight and new management, and Luther found employment as a security consultant, helping to design systems that would prevent future criminal infiltration. Luther's story had become legend among dock workers throughout the port system, a reminder that invisibility could be transformed into the most powerful form of surveillance, and that rejection could become the motivation for extraordinary courage. His success had inspired other workers to report suspicious activities, creating a network of informal oversight that complemented federal monitoring systems.